All right, so the point of the mandatory reporting laws is you're required at the slightest suspicion to report to one of two, to at least, or to one of two authorities, and you're not required and you shouldn't investigate. Just the suspicion, and you should be careful not to taint their testimony. I want to say that childhood sexual abuse in a clinical population, i.e., a hospital setting, I've worked in a hospital before and I've done a lot of interviews, and it's actually it's much more commonplace, as you could guess, than in just sort of a regular population that's non-clinical. Um, I don't know the numbers, but it's quite high. Here is so what could happen if you've been sexually abused? What are some potential sequelae? Oops, let me fix that. I want to get my picture out of the way for you. Um, so let's start with these or let's talk about these. See if I can do this here. Okay, so the first one is this syndrome called PTSD. And some of you, if you've taken abnormal psychology, you know what this is, or some of you have heard of it, but it stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a clinical syndrome. It's in the DSM. It's also in the ICD, and it falls under the anxiety disorders chapter. Some of the symptoms of it, it's post PTSD was something that was identified in World War I. Soldiers coming back having a similar set of symptoms after having been through a traumatic event. Childhood sexual abuse can also cause PTSD. And the symptoms include things like flashbacks, intrusive memories that take you right back to when it happened, nightmares, anxiety, just sort of general anxiety. People with PTSD often avoid certain things, like if you've got somebody who is maybe they avoid watching shows about Vietnam, or they avoid, watching triggering things. Like maybe even somebody who had PTSD from childhood sexual abuse might not want to see this lecture today. Not everybody who's been sexually abused has full-blown PTSD, but many people have symptoms of it. Another thing you see is this attachment disturbance. And the thing that I want to highlight there, let me go ahead to my next slide, is this is our old attachment model here. And generally, if people are pretty good to you and you come to learn that humans are people you can trust and that they're pleasurable, you grow up and have this secure attachment. But if humans do bad things to you, you get anxious around them and you tend to avoid them. So people who've been sexually abused often have problematic attachment and may fall in this more sort of fearful, avoidant category. Clinical depression can be a sequelae of childhood sexual abuse. Also, just a plain old anxiety can be a sequelae of childhood sexual abuse. You can't see this completely, but suicide and self-harm. So all kinds of sort of self-harming behaviors, attempting suicide or cutting on oneself, burning oneself, um, self-harm, those things you see as a sequelae of childhood sexual abuse. Eating disorders, it's kind of self-destructive, self-harm behavior, but you see that too with childhood sexual abuse. Substance abuse, another kind of self-harm. And here's one. They often become victims in other ways as adults. This is how I explain it to my clients, is I say that, our early relationships set us up for later relationships. And if our early relationships, generally we seek what we know. And it's amazing how people who've been victims in childhood will keep choosing perpetrators as partners. I think they miss cues. They tend to be unconsciously attracted to people that are like old perpetrators. And you tend to see this again and again. Also, there are people who've been victimized. Maybe they don't stick up for themselves, or they don't see themselves as worthy of being treated well, and so they tend to attract people who are perpetrators. And so this is something you also see happen. So you can see that the sequelae can be quite severe, but also quite varied. Research, in many cases, it's been difficult to study the effects of childhood sexual abuse because there's many concordant problems like general family stress. Sometimes it's paired with physical abuse. And so it's hard to sort of tease out what the exact sequelae are of childhood sexual abuse compared to other kinds of abuse or neglect or an alcoholic parent or something like that. So I want to say something, um, talk about a slightly different, talk about childhood sexual abuse in a slightly different way. Now, when you saw that my sexual abuse story, um, I mentioned that it's not just an individual problem, it's something that happens within a context because, somebody has to uh, leave a child alone, not notice some cues, enable somebody who's a perpetrator. And so I want to mention another kind of psych theory that comes out of more general systems theory, which is a theory about how it's a theory about how different groups of people interact. Murray Bowen was the inventor of systemic family therapy. I believe that's what he called it back in the 60s or 70s. And um, he talked about this thing that he called open systems and closed systems. And a system, let's just talk about what a system is here. This is nested systems. And a system, the smallest system would be the individual right here. But an individual is part of a bigger system like the family system or maybe like the couple. And the family exists in even bigger systems like the neighborhood or the school district or the town, which also exists in an even bigger nested system like the state or the community or the nation, etc. The Western world. So nested systems. And he said that systems could be closed relatively. It's not a binary. It's not binary, but and closed means that information isn't allowed to come in and out. And open would mean that there's free flow of information. So imagine, for example, you've got this family system. Let's take two systems. The family's nested inside the education system, your school district. And there's some ways set up between the school district and the family to communicate. If you think about it, we have parent-teacher conference, educators send notes home, family maybe there's an intranet that they can communicate on. Now, with closed systems, the communication is minimized. And imagine a family where there's somebody's an alcoholic, and the family says to the kids, "You can't talk about dad's drinking. We're not. We're just not gonna discuss it with people outside of the family." That's example of a closed system. Other things that make this family closed is maybe they don't show up to parent-teacher conference, either because they're drunk or because they're afraid or for a variety of reasons. So the communication breaks down and that it becomes a closed system. And what's been found from research is closed systems, I don't want to say necessarily they breed bad things, but they can maintain things like sexual abuse because nobody finds, if think about it, if somebody found out if child sexual abuse happened once and it was divulged right after that time, there wasn't a sense of I can't talk about this in the kid, and they went and told a teacher right away, it'd probably stop it in its tracks. But that not telling is what keeps it going. It maintains it. Um, so this is the role of family secrets, which is something Marie Bowen talked about. I think it's important when we're talking about things like substance abuse, but also childhood sexual abuse. By the way, I always told my kids that there were no secrets in anything I did, no matter how bad they could tell other people. Um, as a result, they did, and it was kind of embarrassing at times, but that's the way I tried to handle that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about treatment. You're going to read an article for next time, or you read the Adam article. about how treatment isn't very available for something like pedophilia. But I want to say something that's really important here, and it's that pedophilia and sex offense are not the same thing. Remember that pedophilia as a psychological condition is just the attraction to kids. You do not have to have acted on it. If you act on it, then you become a sex offender, right? You've committed a sex offense. But remember, not everybody who offends against children is a pedophile. Think about it. Maybe you're attracted to all kinds of things. Maybe you're more attracted to adults, but you have sex with a child because they're available and they're vulnerable. And you'll see when you watch, there's a video we're going to watch called Pervert Park. You'll see that a lot of the sex offenders in there were also sexually abused. And you'll see that there's one who has committed rape, but has also abused kids. And he does it because they're just there and available. So they're not the same thing. And that's something I'll probably ask on the exam. Treatment usually doesn't exist except in the prison system or in the jail system. So it's usually paired with once you get caught, and it's very often considered mandatory. It's really hard for people who haven't acted on these urges to find treatment. I've never seen training for this. I hope some of you all will consider going into this because I think yeah, I think we need, it's a population. If you have these urges, there's not really a place to turn to. So now is where we would do the case study childhood sexual abuse. That's the thing that's going to be due for an online course tomorrow at 3. So I would recommend that you go and you complete that now, and I'll come back and talk about it. Actually, let me amend that. I'm going to come back and talk about that in the questions video, okay? I want to say a few things about rape. The U.S. rape rate is quite high, as you probably know, and I start off with the question, why is it so high? Usually, legally, rape isn't in the DSM because it's a behavior, not a condition, but it's usually in most states defined as non-consensual oral, anal, and vaginal penetration obtained by force, threat, or when the victim is incapable of giving consent. There's a slightly different definition in Denmark. So this would include if the victim's sleeping or drunk, right? The U.S. rape rate for Western countries is higher than many other countries. And sociologists have studied why that is. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But some historical perspectives about rape is that rape hasn't been illegal for that long, or it's not been a crime against the woman anyway for that long. It was initially viewed as a crime against a man's property. Remember, women were property, they were treated like slaves. And if you committed a rape, it was either a crime against the father if she was unmarried, or against the husband if she was married. There were differences in the medieval times, there were differences between raping a married woman and a virgin, with higher fines for raping a virgin. And throughout history, various armies have raped women of the defeated nation. So it was considered, a spoil of war. I also want to point out, you can't see this right now, but marital rape laws didn't begin to change in the U.S. until the 1970s. And I think maybe it was Georgia was the last one to make marital rape also illegal. But think about it, how that comes from history, that if you're married to somebody, you own them, and so therefore you're entitled to use their body for your purposes.